Our next speaker is Dr. Avigail Manekin-Bamberger. Avigail was a Martin Buber Fellow in the Society of Martin Buber Postdoctoral Fellows at the Hebrew University. She's now a member of the faculty in the Department for the Study of the Jewish People at the Hebrew University. And she's worked, among other things, on one of the fields that was very much at the core of Shaul Shaked's life work, especially in the last several decades of his life, namely the incantation bowls from Mesopotamia. Please, Avigail.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Shulman, and to the organizers, Professor Strumza. And I wanted to begin with a personal story. So about a decade ago, I decided to write my master's thesis on parallels between the Aramaic incantation bowls and the Babylonian Talmud. My then master's thesis advisor, Professor Menachem Kahana, suggested that I go speak with Professor Shaul Shaked to get myself more acquainted with these unusual materials. I then promptly wrote an email to Professor Shaked introducing myself and requesting to meet, to which he immediately responded and invited me to meet with him in his home office in Blumenfeld 8, which I'm sure many of you know. I updated my thesis advisor about the upcoming meeting, who then warned me that I should fully understand that I am about to meet a very important and world-renowned scholar. I thus did what any petrified grad student would do at this point and spent all my time before the meeting reading anything I could on the subject. When the day of the meeting finally arrived, I was generously greeted by Professor Shaked, who walked me up the steps and took the time to go over all the relevant books from his library shelves while giving me insightful book reviews, not holding back on criticism, and always maintaining a great sense of humor with a twinkle in his eye. After that, he opened the 1913 first scientific edition of the Aramaic incantation bowls, written by James Montgomery, and put it before me. He then asked me to decipher the bowl text, translate it, and explain its meaning to him. Most fortunately, in my pre-meeting preparation, I happened to focus on the same exact text and thus passed my unexpected exam. Ever since then, Professor Shaked was always open to questions and conversations, providing sharp insights and a wide range of knowledge. Years later, when I updated him that I got a position at the Jewish History Department at Hebrew U, he responded with congratulations, and in his typical humorous manner added that he hopes that I will never forget the angels and divine names who are obviously the ones responsible for my achievement. I responded that I will indeed always remember these angels. However, I didn't share with him that these must have been the exact same angels who assisted me in passing my exam with him in our first meeting at Blumenfeld 8. So my talk today will focus on enslaved individuals in the Sasanian Empire from the perspective of the magic bowls. This study, as well as my other research projects, could not have been possible without the meticulous and groundbreaking work of Professor Shaul Shaked. Professor Shaked was not only responsible for numerous decipherings and publications of Aramaic incantation bowls, but he was also one of the first scholars to use these bowls in order to draw historical conclusions regarding the social and cultural makeup of the Sasanian Empire. In addition, he and Professor Neve were the first to read these artifacts alongside other Jewish magical texts from antiquity and the Middle Ages, thus deepening our knowledge of the great Jewish magical tradition and paving the road for a new and exciting scholarly field to emerge. As in other ancient civilizations, slavery was a vital component of Sasanian society. In general, most of the scholarship on Sasanian slavery has focused mainly on the legal aspects of enslaved people, as the bulk of the evidence arrives from legal compilations. Additionally, some studies have been conducted on the literary representations of slaves in various religious texts. While these studies greatly advanced our knowledge of Sasanian institutions of slavery, the social history and daily experience of enslaved people still remain mostly unknown. It seems reasonable to assume that the lack of such studies is the result of the dearth of archaeological evidence related to slavery, especially in comparison with the Roman and Byzantine empires, such as the artifacts you can see on the screen and the mosaics. An overlooked source for reconstructing the social history of enslaved people and approaches toward them are contemporary magical texts, and in particular the Aramaic incantation bowls. But first, some introductory words about the bowls. So the bowls were generally used to protect households from demons, curses, and malevolent forces. Some were intended for other purposes, such as success in business, cursing enemies, gaining favor in the eyes of named individuals, and more. A scribe wrote incantations, divine names, curses, and spells in ink on the surface of an earthenware bowl, usually in a spiral fashion, such as in this bowl. And there are around 600 published bowls and more than 1,500 that still remain unpublished. Only a few hundred are provenance, mostly from Nippur, modern-day southern central Iraq. Most of the bowls are written in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic and in square Hebrew letters, while others are written in Syriac and Mandaic. The bowls are mostly dated to the 5th to 7th centuries CE based on archaeological evidence of the provenance bowls, as well as a number of unpublished bowls, such as this one, that provide explicit dates according to the Seleucid era. The practical nature of these texts and the fact that they were not subject to transmission and redaction make them an indispensable source for retrieving real-life attitudes and beliefs regarding enslaved people, perspectives that we usually do not have access to. The bowls reveal a desire to protect enslaved people, like any other household asset, alongside fear and anxiety about those who are possessions or objects, yet have a will and desire of their own, and therefore a potential to harm their possessor. So today I will focus on three interrelated analyses on the subject. First, a study of the occurrence of slaves in various lists for protection of households as utterers of curses among other individuals, and in lists of people who are summoned to bring economic success. Second, a magic text intended to retrieve a named runaway slave in a Syriac magic bowl, perhaps written by a Jewish scribe. And third, a discussion of persistent notions that connect slave with the demonic in bowls and in other contemporary sources, in text and in imagery. Slave and maidservants appear in a number of incantation bowls, and with one exception, no mention is made of their names. Rather, slave, avda, or the slave, and maidservants. In addition, many bowl texts mention a general request to protect the people of the house, anshe bita, which most probably included domestic slave. This could be inferred from the use of the general idiom after the named wife and children, meaning the people of the house, were separate from the nuclear family, and from its use with regard to slaves. Explicitly, we could learn from a passage from the Babylonian Talmud, which reads, the context is what is considered anger that is permitted, and the anger that is permitted is one that the purpose of it is to instill fear in the people of the house. So we have some examples. Rav Yehuda would pull out strings from a garment, Rav Achasan of Yaakov would break broken vessels, and Rav Sheshet would throw fish water on the head of his maidservant. And sorry about that. This passage is revealing not only because it uses the idiom people of the house with reference to slaves, but also because it legitimizes violent acts performed by well-known rabbis in order to gain control and authority over the household workers. The desire for control over enslaved people is a dominant theme in the magic bowls as well, as I will demonstrate shortly. So slaves, maidservants, and people of the house are mentioned in the bowls most commonly as items in lists. Lists are an integral part of the poetics of Aramaic incantation bowls, corresponding to larger trends in magical texts. Assembling a list enables the practitioner to cover as much ground as possible in one small text. Lists may be composed of the individuals seeking protection, or the harmful dangers they seek protection from, or the benevolent agents invoked for such protection. Attention to the specific location of enslaved people within such lists reveal two main types, as can be demonstrated in the following texts. The bowl contains two lists in which the scribe invokes divine protection for Frochadad, his wife, their sons, daughters, various cattle, and property. In both lengthy lists, the scribe mentions the slaves and maidservants of Frochadad's home. In the first list, he positions them between the donkeys and the cattle, and in the second, he places them right after the sons and daughters and before the lists of various animals. These two placements are consistent with other lists in the bowls in all dialects in which slaves are listed either right after the children of the household or alongside property and livestock. Similar constructions are found also regarding the idiom people of the house. It is important to stress that these two types of placements are unique to enslaved people, as sons and daughters, for example, appear right after the client and the wife and before animals or property and never among the property. Thus, it seems reasonable to assume that these lists may reflect the attitudes of both scribes, perhaps unconscious ones, regarding the status of these individuals, either as property or as individual agents. These conflicting notions are compatible with the tension commonly found in legal sources as well. In addition to lists that extend protection to all the household, including animals and inanimate objects, there are lists restricted to humans, including slaves. For example, in a Babylonian Jewish Aramaic bowl intended for business prosperity, we find, may there be healing from heaven for Vartan, son of Mirai, and for the coming to him of men and of women, Jews and Gentiles, strangers and relatives, and of those who are honest and dishonest, and male servants and female servants, may they come and deal with him regarding his livelihood, etc. So this bowl text is intended to gather multitudes of people to come to the business of one Vartan, son of Mirai. The people in this list represent various opposing pairs. Among them, we find the pair of slaves and maidservants. This text reveals the presence of slaves and maidservants in the markets, while attesting to the fact that their purchasing power was important enough to be summoned by a practitioner. Similar occurrences in lists of various humans appear in bowls intended to rebuke curses of individuals. For example, in a partially published Mandaic bowl, we find a list of foes and opponents of a named couple, and then the words men and women, and manservants and maidservants, and free men and free women, and poor and rich, etc. And we have in that article by Ford and Abudram another example of a Syriac bowl text that very similarly protects from witchcraft of these various individuals. So in these examples, slave and maidservants are mentioned among a range of possible individuals who can harm the clients as foes and opponents and as utterers of curses and witchcraft. The composition of these various lists aim at incorporating the widest possible range of potentially harmful human beings, be them male or female, free or enslaved, rich or poor, thus emphasizing the extensive effectiveness of the spell, fitting the poetics of lists and magical texts in general. These attestations may reveal not only aspects of the function of enslaved people as potential consumers, but also their significance as independent agents that can cause various harms, prompting people to seek magical protection from these threats. Slaveholders' anxiety regarding their slaves is also evident in a common genre of ancient magic intended for retrieving runaway slaves. These types of spells are found in various ancient and late antique sources, including recipes from Jewish and Greco-Roman magical handbooks, later also in the Cairo Geniza, also metal amulets and curse tablets, and also earlier ancient Mesopotamian texts in a different fashion. In the published materials of the incantation bowls, there is only one bowl intended specifically for retrieving a named slave. The texts appear on a Syriac incantation bowl, written in a Strangula script from the Iraqi Museum in Baghdad, and it was republished by Marco Morigi, who I'm going to use his edition and translation. So I'm reading the first part of the text. Prepared is this mystery for the sealing of Bar Sehada, son of Amin, the servant of Chomiz, son of Machlafta, who is called Bat Nuchra. In the name of the angel Asriel, who binds and does not untie, and in the name of Sabach Kadosh Allah Allah, whose divine presence dwells upon cherubs of fire, and his throne is established in the supreme height before him. And they bind the slaves into the hands of their lords, and they rebuke the sons in front of their fathers, and they subdue the powerful sons and the slaves who perform magic acts in front of their lord. And they sit on the door of Chomiz, son of Machlafta, and on the threshold, and on the roof of Chomiz, son of Machlafta, and they subdue the slave of Chomiz, son of Machlafta, Bar Sehada, son of Amin, and his hired man and his sons, and they do not allow them to flee. So the explicit purpose of this bowl text is to seal and subdue the named slave, Bar Sehada, son of Amin. As noted by Morigi, the meaning of the slave's name is son of martyrs, a Christian name. The client of the bowl and master of the household, in contrast, has a Persian name, Chomiz, which is written with various variations throughout the bold text. In relation to the theme of the conference, it bears stressing that although this is a Syriac bowl, some grammatical forms are closer to Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, as pointed by Murigi, and I think that the contents itself may also point to a Jewish scribe, a phenomenon that would fit other Syriac bowls that contain Jewish themes, a fact that led some scholars to associate Syriac bowls with Jewish practitioners. In this bowl, the names of the angels and deities are invoked are comparable to the late antique Jewish magical genre of Hechalot. I won't go into this, but even just to see the similar concepts of the Holy Throne, etc. And also some of the wording fits the Jewish Targum of Pseudo-Yonatan better than the Syriac Pshita. Finally, the very practice of summoning angels to bind the enslaved person and return him to his master is attested in the contemporary Jewish Book of Mysteries, Sefer HaRazim, from late antique Palestine. I won't read the whole thing, but this is a sort of instruction how to use angels for, among other things, a slave who fled and to bring him against his will back to his master. So in terms of the meaning of the text, I'm going back to the bold text, the angel Asriel, whose name derives from the root asar, to bind, alongside other divine beings, are summoned to protect the client by sitting around the possible escape routes from the house, the door, the threshold, and the roof, thus not allowing the slave and other domestic workers to escape. The incantation states that the role of these divine beings in the heaven is to bind and subdue slaves and rebelling sons from performing unwanted and unanticipated actions in front of their master. The text thus targets the individual agency and the will of the subordinate individual of the household by appointing powerful agents to prevent any possibility of escape. However, if one subordinate still manages to flee, the second part of the incantation, which I will read now, is intended to bring him back. Wait, yes. And the one who flees, the hired man and the son who flee, they are let loose upon them the seven holy angel. Asriel, who binds their feet, and Nekatiel, who gathers them in sheaves, and Kabshiel subdues them in front of their Lord. Mashmashiel makes their heart serve him, and Sakriel something in front of him. Blamiel muzzles their tongues for him. Adom, etc. issues an oracle about them. The translation there isn't clear. And which slave and the son and the hired man who flees, Sakriel shuts up their mouth for him until not according to the slave's own will, his coming back. You are the holy angels who do the will of their Lord. So the seven angels invoked in this text are each responsible to bind and force the slave back to his master in various ways. Some are responsible to bind his body parts, such as his feet, and some to bind his mind and his will. For example, the angel Mashmashiel, derived from the root shamash, to serve, is summoned to bind the heart of the enslaved individual, causing him to desire to serve his master. In addition, the angel Blamiel, deriving from the root balam, to muzzle or to silence, is in charge of muzzling the tongues of the enslaved people, while Sakariel, deriving from sakar, to shut up, shuts the mouth of the slaves until they want to come back from their own will. These seven angels, therefore, do not only serve as agents of divine law enforcement, returning the bodies of runaway property, but they are also summoned to control the minds, the heart, the will, and the desire of these rebel slaves. The fact that the incantation targets the individual will of the enslaved person may help further elucidate a basic paradox of the institution of slavery. Slavery is built upon the notion that enslaved people have the will and qualifications of humans, which makes them valuable for their master more than animals or some other possessions. But these same properties are also what disrupts the master's ability to control the enslaved person like any other possession. In other words, the more valuable the enslaved person is, the more independent he is, and the more independency and agency puts the master in greater danger. Controlling the will of the enslaved person may therefore neutralize this tension by making him a perfect server for his master. Highlighting the tension between the autonomous will of the enslaved person and the master's need to control him may shed light on attitudes towards demons as well. Demons were similarly perceived as individual agents dwelling in one's home and surroundings and present in one's most intimate moments. Late antique texts regarding both slaves and demons attest to a strong desire to control, chain, and constrain these agents. A variety of contemporary sources suggest that demons and enslaved people were conceptually connected, and at times even conflated in a number of ways. So the most explicit connection between the two is found in incantations that ward off demons who appear as slaves or maidservants, such as in a Jewish Babylonian Aramaic incantation bowls, published partially also in Shaked, Ford, and Byro's Aramaic Bowl Spells, Volume 1, that reads, and may they never appear to them in their, and this is about the demons, and may they never appear to them in their houses in any form, neither as slaves nor as maidservants. In other words, it is possible that demons can appear in the form of a domestic slave or a maidservant, causing harm to people and thus blurring the boundaries between potential causes of harm within the household. Beyond this explicit connection, the general conceptualization of demons as slaves and of slaves as demons is widespread. One of the most significant texts, and perhaps the earliest to connect the two, is the Greek Testament of Solomon, dated to the 1st to 3rd centuries CE. In this well-known account, God grants Solomon a ring in which he shall imprison all the demons, both female and male, and with their help he shall build the Jerusalem. As demonstrated by Duet, the language employed in the Testament of Solomon for the capture, interrogation, and enslavement of the demons is compatible with what we know regarding captives of war who were forced into slavery. Moreover, and this is an interesting point that he makes, the demons are invoked and subdued for the construction work of the temple, respective to their gender. Male demons are employed as stone cutters and builders, while female demons are responsible for spinning and rope making. The legend of Shlomo and his demon slaves was highly influential in late antiquity and was adopted in later sources such as the Babylonian Talmud and the Quran. For our purposes, it is interesting to note that the connection between slavery and demons does not stop at mythical or biblical figures. So we have in the Babylonian Talmud, for example, a story about Rav Papa who owned a demon as a sort of household servant, and there's a story about him going to fetch water for him and being careful about evil water, but we can't get into that. So these conceptualizations of demons as slaves and slaves as demons continue to thrive and evolve in medieval times, with many necromantic texts designated for the purpose of summoning demons and coercing them to perform various deeds as slaves. Finally, the connection between slaves and demons can be easily demonstrated by the well-known story from Arabian Nights about a genie, a jinn, meaning a demon, who presents himself as the slave of the lamp, which some of you know better as Aladdin. The proposed connection between slaves and demons should not necessarily take us by surprise. Both demons and slaves were perceived as individual agents with the ability to attack when a person is most vulnerable. In late antiquity, magic practitioners attempted to gain dominance by controlling and binding the rebellious subordinate individuals. Thus, as in the aforementioned Syriac bowl text, aimed to retrieve a runaway slave, demons are controlled and restrained by summoning angels to put them in chains. In a very recent publication, Volume 2 of Aramaic Bowl Spells, we find a text against demons and Liliths that reads, I have put you, the demon, under oath, that if you go out from the house, it will be well. And if not, I will bring against you which is dear to you and that which is powerful to you. What is dear to me and powerful to me, I will bring 60 men that will bind you with chains of bronze by your feet and fetters of bronze upon your hands and bonds of irons upon your limbs, collars of bronze upon your neck. By the name of the angel Gabriel and by the name of Azrael, the strong and mighty one who is appointed over collars and over chains. This incantation evokes various angels to chain the body parts of the demons with the goal of bringing to their utter adherence and submissiveness, a practice that echoes the method to retrieve the runaway slave we have seen above. The chains and bindings are quite specific, attesting perhaps to knowledge of different technical terms and materials of bondage. Beyond the connection of magical methods to gain dominance over slaves and demons, the common imageries of chaining and binding demons while expecting their utter adherence and submissiveness may have been known to the practitioners of magic from their real-life encounters with enchained individuals. These could have been captives, prisoners, or slaves who were at times chained in public spaces. Indeed, a story from the Babylonian Talmud demonstrates the restraint of a named domestic slave in a way that is reminiscent of binding demons that we have seen above. The context is a legal discussion about immersion in a ritual bath for the sake of conversion and manumission. So I'm reading from Tractate Chulin. Minyamin, Rav Ashi's slave, when he wished to immerse himself in the ritual bath, Rav Ashi passed him to Ravina and Rav Acha, son of Rava, and he said to them, "Be aware that I will claim compensation for him from you if he goes a procedure of manumission." They placed a collar upon the slave's neck, and at the moment of immersion, they loosened it and then immediately tightened it again. They initially loosened it in order that there should not be any interposition between the slave and the water during the ritual immersion. Then they immediately tightened it again in order that the slave should not preempt them and say to them, "I am immersing for the sake of becoming a freeman." When he, the slave Minyamin, lifted his head from the water, they placed a bucket of clay upon his head and said to him, "Go and bring this to the house of your master." A ritual immersion is valid only if there is nothing interposing between the water and the body. Since slaves underwent manumission through ritual immersion, the fear was that Minyamin would intend to use this immersion in order to set himself free and not just to gain ritual purity. In order to prevent this, the rabbis tightened a collar on Minyamin's neck and loosened it only when the slave was fully immersed in the water, thus allowing the water to reach the whole of his body. To make it clear that Minyamin was still a slave, the rabbis, at the end of this, placed a vessel of clay on his head immediately and commanded him to go to his master. Placing a vessel of clay on his head, or perhaps a vessel with clay, fits a widespread Mesopotamian symbol of slavery from much earlier times, in which kings were portrayed on stelae and figurines with baskets with clay on their heads as a symbol of their submissiveness to God. These imageries fit a Mesopotamian ritual in which rulers bear a laborer's basket with brick mold on his head to inaugurate a temple. Both the Mesopotamian symbol and the rabbinic account fit the local ecological landscape, in which clay was used widely for building through mud brick, as well as for pottery, tablets, and more, since this material was naturally and abundantly available from the rivers. Thus, the symbol of work in Mesopotamia was closely connected to the use, transfer, and distribution of clay, and therefore commanding the slave, Minyamin, to return with a vessel of clay to his master may indeed symbolize his servitude. The image of a basket on a chained individual's head is also reminiscent of some images of demons on the incantation bowls that are seemingly carrying something on their head. This, could be, I think this looks alike, but this could be, of course, a subject of discussion, and this is the reproduction of the image by Naama Vilozhny. Most of the images on the incantation bowls consist of demons and demonesses in chains, bound by their heads, feet, and neck in various ways. Here are some examples from the Musayov collection in the National Library. A close look at these images may reinforce the proposed connection between demons and slaves. Moreover, the connection assists in understanding the images themselves and perhaps even reconstructing contemporary practices of binding enslaved people. Similar to the bowl I read before, with the details of the various chains and bindings placed on the demons, the images on the bowls also present a wide variety of chains and shackles on various parts of the demon's body. For example, demons are bound in collars, such as here. They're bound in collars either only on their neck or they're connected to other body parts, or in this image, they are chained to another demon's collar. This would fit the story of Minyamin's that I read before, in which he was chained on the neck. It is possible that these type of collars were known to bowl practitioners from their real-life encounters with bound slaves. Now, this is an image from the Roman Empire, but it still may be connected to contemporary practices or later practices of binding slaves. In addition to slave collars and various chains, the bowls also attest to a number of seals presented on the images. This may be connected to an object referred to in the Babylonian Talmud as the seal of the slave. These are, and it's mentioned in the Talmud in Tractate Shabbat in the context of if one can carry it or not. I won't go into that, but the Babylonian Talmud describes them as either situated on the neck or on the clothes of the enslaved person. Unfortunately, the Talmud doesn't detail the function of these seals. However, it does note that the seal was made by the master, either from clay or from metal, and that the slave was afraid to remove it. It is thus possible that the seals described in the Talmud may be similar to findings of slave collars from the Roman Empire, such as the Zoninus collar that you see here, which bears the inscription in Latin, and I'll read the translation. I have run away, hold me, when you have brought me back to my master Zoninus, you will receive a gold coin. It appears that a number of images on the bowls may demonstrate these type of practices. As you could see here, this is actually a reproduction of the same image here, that you could see some sort of tag or seal on the demons. So sometimes we find inscriptions hanging from the neck or from the clothes here of the demons, and most of these inscriptions are not legible. They're consisting simply of letter sequences. If this reading is correct, the image of bound demons wearing slave collars may assist in reconstructing actual practices of chaining and branding enslaved people in the Sasanian Empire. So Aristotle famously deemed the slave as a living possession and an instrument. A study of the materials from the Sasanian Empire fits this label, but only to a certain extent. The legal materials indeed detailed the technical implications of being perceived as a living possession. However, due to their practical nature, the magic bowls deepen our understanding of the desire and anxieties regarding enslaved people. Lists in the bowls, for example, reveal the desire not only to protect enslaved people, as one would expect from the category living possession, but also to avoid the harm enslaved people can cause by their ability to pronounce curses and perform sorcery. Moreover, a close reading of a Syriac bowl text intended for a named enslaved individual revealed tensions and anxiety regarding genuine options of rebellion, not just by the slave's body, but also by his heart and by his mind. This study also highlights a recurring connection between portrayals of demons and enslaved people in late antique texts. This proposed connection assists in retrieving real-life attitudes towards enslaved individuals, as both the slave and the demon were perceived as beings who dwell closely with an individual desire and ability to harm. The common means for dealing these threats was by binding and constraining them to the will of their master. The overlapping portrayals not only assist in understanding the many ancient texts and images connecting the two, but also in reconstructing late antique practices of binding and branding enslaved individuals. It bears stressing, and this is an important point for me, that the proposed connection between slaves and demons is not a metaphorical one. Rather, it expresses actual beliefs that blur boundaries between the two, and therefore demonstrate the complex perception of the enslaved person in late antique society. Finally, while the incantation bowls brought us closer to understanding such complexities and tensions regarding to societies with slaves, we are still left with a gaping hole common to the bowls and to the literary texts, namely the points of views of the enslaved individual themselves. In other words, while the magic bowls attest to real-life attitudes regarding slavery, they still derive from the perspective of the slave holders and not that of the enslaved person. It stands to reason that in the Sasanian Empire, enslaved people too had their own magical means to deal with the hardships of their lives. These may have been manifested in objects or various magical words or actions, but for now, the nature of these methods still remain unknown. Thank you.
Thank you, Avigail. Listening to your lecture, I was thinking that if Shaul had been able to hear it, he would have been very pleased and interested. And that's, I think, the highest compliment I can give you.
Definitely.
I like to think that if Nico was right, that perhaps in the Zoroastrian heaven across the river, he was indeed listening to this talk. Let's hope so. We have some minutes for questions before we take a break. Please, no? Did you have a question? No. Yoni, I'm here. Please use the microphone.
Thank you. So forgive me if I missed something. It was very rich and jam-packed with information, so I might have missed this. But so you interestingly show how in some cases demons can be understood as slaves in a way. And you show how demons control slaves, but is there evidence of slaves being understood as demons? Did that come up?
Yeah, so the closest evidence is that slaves, not necessarily understood as demons, but they can, as any other being, be controlled by demons and show them, and that they're actually demons, but they look like slaves. So the connection is in a way two-sided in that the means, more about also the means to control the various entities or humans, but it's really a way of maybe, if really these are, there's a connection that has to do with how they are bound and how they are perceived, so it may have also affected how people saw slaves, which a lot of times, as has been studied, a lot of times slaves really look different. They're coming from somewhere else, they're captives, they don't always know your native language, so there may have been some sort of a connection also with domestic slaves that has to do with this sort of difference between them. But I do think that this is a connection that could be understood both ways.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you very much, Avigail. I have an unfair question. I mean, I liked what the texts and the picts, and I thought sometimes that the people connected through the neck were like rebetants in Hasidic marriages. My question is the following. What does all the rich material that you brought, how does it contribute, how does it integrate the broader picture of what happens in other texts, and before and after, East and West? What is the specific contribution to a history of slavery from antiquity to the Middle Ages that you think this might show in the future?
Okay.
That's why I said it was unfair.
No, totally fair, and thank you for that. I think that what we have, especially in the Sasanian Empire, but also in other ancient societies, is a lot of history of the slaves from the legal perspective. What was their exact status and what they were allowed and what they weren't allowed, and sometimes also religious texts that depict slavery in different ways that a lot of times are a metaphor for a man with his God. And I think that this and other material evidence that we do not have from the Sasanian Empire, such as that slave tag that I mentioned, gets us closer to the perspective of real-life people who were dealing with these people. When we have a text with a name of a slave, actual living slave from the 6th or 7th century, we could get closer to how they were perceived on a daily basis in culture, and not just from the perspective of what was their status. So I think the bowls, and this is true not only for slavery, but for also connections between religions, relation to mystical experiences or gender, etc., we just get a different perspective from materials that were actually in use by many, many people, and not just the elite who was writing law and other didactic texts. So that would be my answer.
Please.
Thank you very much for the very, very interesting paper. Maybe I missed something, but could you please tell me, in the contemporary or slightly later Iranian texts, we find many terms for different types of slaves. So slave in general, captive slave, the debt slave, and so on. Do we see something similar in Aramaic Niveau and on these magic bowls in particular?
Well, thank you for that question. We usually just find the term slave, avda, but there is in the Syriac text, if you remember, I brought just the English translation, there was the slave and the hired man. And it's the slave, the maidservant or the female slave and the hired man. And it's interesting that there is a contemporary Syriac text that names this trio, which I think that it may be some sort of an idiom of slaves that are maybe, some domestic slaves that are all the time in the house, and then hired slaves that maybe you pay them monthly, or I don't know, we pay them on a temporary basis. So that's the only place that I find some sort of hint to types of for a different type of slave, but other than that, it's pretty formulaic as other things in the bowls, which are usually formulaic. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you something, or maybe two things. First of all, I'm interested in the cosmology. So I wonder, can you tell us in what domain, let us say, the angels lived or inhabited, and what the connection is, let us say, to the Hechalot literature or something like that? You know?
Okay, that is a current project of mine, and if I have another 45 minutes, I guess. No, but really, I think that this is a very important point, or the question you are asking, because usually in the study of late antique Jewish magic and mysticism, there is a lot of times a differentiation between the mystical literature, which is so-called heavenly experiences, and magic, which is much more practical. But also in the Hechalot literature and also in magic bowls, we find more of a mix between practical aspects of mystical knowledge and the other way around. I do think, and this is something I'm working on now, that the bowls are deeply part of this sort of hechalot or celestial understandings, and that basically the Jewish magic in the incantation bowls and also in the contemporary amulets from late antique Palestine are built on these notions of the knowledge of angels and divine names are what makes the magic possible. So it's very much connected. You have to know the angels, you have to know their functions, and after you know that, you could also use something and do other different actions.
So perhaps their true existence is a linguistic one, in sound and name.
Linguistic, but linguistic in the most deepest sense.
Yeah, exactly, right. Any other questions? Because if not, I wanted to ask you something about the language. I remember hearing Shaul speak about this, so okay, it's in Babylonian Jewish Aramaic. But correct me if I'm wrong, I think that there are all kinds of linguistic interpenetrations, Iranian, Greek, Latin, perhaps, I don't know. Do you want to say something more about the language?
Yeah, so Shaul Shaket has a few important articles about this issue. I'll just maybe talk a bit about the connection between, we have, as I mentioned, Babylonian Aramaic, Syriac, and Mandaic. While the Babylonian Aramaic and the Mandaic bowls, each one are very appropriate of their own religious culture, and you could find different motifs. The Syriac, like we saw here, also has grammatical forms which are closer to Jewish Babylonian Aramaic. And also in terms of content, we find a close connection a lot of times within Syriac bowls, such as in this bowl that leads to maybe think that this is a Jewish practitioners. And except for that, there are loan words and from Middle Persian that Shaket has written about. And on the one hand, there is a sort of mix. On the other hand, I would be careful of using such words such as syncretistic or popular, because I think a lot of times there is a differentiation, and inside the bowl corpus we could make subdivisions that are actually not syncretistic at all. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Syncretism is a word which I myself have commanded my students never to use, actually. So,